The funeral hall was heavy with silence when Daryl Oots walked in, his hand firmly grasping the hand of Ashley, his visibly pregnant mistress. The couple's arrival caused a ripple through the mourners. Daryl didn't glance at anyone. He didn't flinch. He simply walked forward with Ashley by his side, her round belly making the affair impossible to ignore. Denise Malone stood by her father's casket, her face unreadable, her gaze steady. Guests turned in their seats, and whispers filled the air, some assuming she had no power left, others wondering how long she had known. But what no one there knew, what Daryl certainly didn't know, was that Denise had already taken control of her own future. The will had already been read. The assets were already protected. And this funeral, the one Daryl believed would be the end of her, was actually the moment that sealed his own fate. Denise Malone had always been a woman of observation, a trait she inherited from her father. It was something he had drilled into her from a young age, the importance of watching carefully and thinking critically, rather than reacting impulsively. And now, as she stood in the hallway of their shared home, watching Daryl Oots from the corner of her eye, she couldn't help but feel the weight of that lesson in a way she had never before. It wasn't the first time she had noticed his growing distance. At first, the small signs were easy to dismiss. An extra hour spent at work, a few more business trips, an offhand comment about needing space that he quickly followed with a joke to cover his discomfort. Denise had learned to keep her suspicions to herself, choosing instead to observe and document. But over time, the cracks in their marriage had deepened, no longer hidden behind the facade of a busy schedule or the occasional disagreement. Denise was keenly aware of the change in Daryl's behavior. It started with his phone, always kept face down on the table, a habit that seemed innocent enough until the day it wasn't. Then came the passwords, the sudden insistence on privacy, where once there had been none. He no longer made eye contact when they spoke, his gaze often darting to the window, the television, anywhere but her. Denise didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was a way of waiting, a way of making sure the cracks in the marriage weren't ignored or dismissed. She could feel the distance between them widening, but she didn't confront it. She simply watched. The first time Denise saw the unmistakable signs of an affair was when Daryl's behavior shifted from subtle neglect to overt arrogance. He was more careless with his words, too confident in the spaces he had begun to occupy outside of their home. It wasn't just his late nights anymore or his incessant need for privacy. It was the small details, the way he never told her when he would be home, the way he no longer made an effort to include her in his plans. It was the feeling that he had already decided their marriage was a formality, a placeholder for something else. Denise's suspicions grew clearer with each passing day, and still, she said nothing. Confrontation wasn't her style, and she knew that it wasn't her answer. Daryl would simply deny everything, claim she was overthinking, and accuse her of not trusting him. It was a trap she was well aware of, one she would not fall into. Instead, Denise did what she did best. She observed. She recorded. She documented. Every phone call that was too short, every dinner that went cold, every unexplained absence. She stored it all away, not out of desperation, but out of necessity. If things were to fall apart, if her suspicions were ever confirmed, she would be prepared. The months leading up to the inevitable moment were filled with a quiet tension that only Denise seemed to understand. She spent her days at home, maintaining the usual routine, while Daryl became increasingly absent, his presence in their shared life feeling more like an obligation than a choice. Denise had learned early on that silence was more powerful than anger, and she had grown accustomed to using it as her shield. She let Daryl slip further away, knowing full well that the distance he was creating between them would only serve to strengthen her resolve. And then came the day that everything changed. It wasn't a grand moment. It wasn't a fight or an accusation. It was a single moment of realization, the kind that strikes quietly but irrevocably. Denise was sitting in the living room, flipping through old photo albums, when Daryl came home late, as he often did. He didn't greet her, didn't ask about her day, didn't offer the kind of small courtesies that had once come so naturally. Instead, he dropped his briefcase on the floor, muttered something about being tired, and disappeared into their bedroom. It was in that moment that Denise knew without a shadow of doubt that the man she had married no longer existed. Daryl had already mentally checked out. The affair was no longer a possibility. It was a fact, an eventuality she had only been waiting for. But rather than reacting, Denise did what she had always done best. She remained still. She remained silent. Over the next few weeks, Denise turned her attention to other matters that had nothing to do with Daryl, but everything to do with the future she was quietly preparing for. Her father, Robert Malone, had passed away months before, leaving her with a legacy she had not yet fully realized. At the time, Denise had been too consumed with the emotional toll of losing her father to think about what that inheritance would mean for her. But as the distance between her and Daryl grew wider, the weight of her father's foresight became increasingly clear. She began organizing her father's finances, not because she needed the money, but because it was time to take control of what was hers. Denise had always known her father was meticulous with his wealth, but she hadn't fully understood the extent of his planning until she began reviewing his papers. He had prepared her for this. He had structured everything in a way that protected her, that ensured she would never have to rely on anyone, not even Daryl. As she sifted through the documents, Denise was struck by the careful way in which her father had set everything up. He had anticipated everything, even her marriage. There were no loose ends, no gaps in coverage. The trust he had set up for her was airtight, the assets carefully shielded from prying eyes. Even if Daryl had known about it, he would have been powerless to touch it. For the first time in a long while, Denise felt a sense of relief. The foundation her father had laid out for her was firm and unshakable. She knew what she needed to do, and for once, it wasn't about her marriage. It wasn't about Daryl. It was about her. Denise's silence was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. And as she continued to organize her father's estate, she realized that Daryl's assumption of control over her life and their marriage was built on a foundation of ignorance. She had never been as helpless as he believed her to be. The next few days were spent in quiet preparation. Denise didn't make any grand gestures. She didn't throw herself into a frenzy of legal action or confrontation. Instead, she methodically continued her work, ensuring that her father's legacy was secured and that nothing would stand in the way of her independence. The house was quiet, just as it had always been. But now, Denise felt something shift inside her, a certainty that she had been too afraid to fully embrace until now. She was no longer a passive participant in her life. She was taking control step by quiet step. As she closed the final folder, Denise's gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. The time had come. She had prepared. She had waited. And now, she was ready to face whatever Daryl might throw at her. Her silence had not been weakness. It had been preparation. And soon Daryl would understand just how wrong he had been to underestimate her. Denise stood in the quiet of the living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Her eyes flickered over the papers spread out before her. Documents her father had carefully organized, his legacy meticulously planned. It wasn't just money or assets he had left her. It was the structure, the protection, the assurance that she would never be caught unprepared. It was a system that had taken years to build, and now it was her turn to manage it. She had been avoiding the reality for a while now, but as the weeks had gone on, it became harder to ignore the growing distance between her and Daryl. His excuses for late nights had become more frequent. His calls and texts to Ashley had become less subtle, their frequency making it impossible to ignore. The first few signs had been small, an odd look in his eye when he spoke of work, a hint of frustration in his tone when he spoke to her. But now it was all but undeniable. Daryl had begun his affair with Ashley Miller in earnest. a woman younger, more eager to flatter him, more willing to offer the kind of admiration Denise had long since stopped offering. Denise could see it clearly now. Daryl's wandering eye had become a wandering heart. It was no longer just about the late nights or the secrecy. It was about his belief that his desires, his needs, and his wants were paramount. But still, Denise didn't confront him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she returned to the task at hand, organizing, categorizing, and reviewing the stack of legal documents her father had left behind. It was no longer just about managing the estate. It was about securing her own future, a future that Daryl had no part in. She wasn't angry. Anger had never served her. She wasn't hurt, at least not in the way she knew Daryl expected her to be. She was, however, focused. In her silence there was power. In her restraint there was strength. And in her preparation, there was a quiet certainty that Daryl would soon realize just how wrong he was to assume he had control. Each document she reviewed only solidified her resolve. She traced her fingers over the contracts, the terms of the trust, the intricate web her father had woven to ensure his wealth would be protected. There was no ambiguity here. There was no room for interpretation. The legal framework was airtight, the assets secured in a way that Daryl would never be able to touch. He would try, of course, he always did. He would argue, he would complain, he would push and pull at the boundaries that had been set. But it wouldn't matter. Denise wasn't playing a game. She wasn't fighting a battle in the traditional sense. She was simply allowing things to unfold as they should, according to the plan her father had set in motion long ago. It was a plan that had nothing to do with Daryl. She knew he believed that by bringing Ashley into their life, he would destabilize her, weaken her. He thought that by bringing his mistress to the funeral, he could break her. He was wrong. The funeral, in his mind, was the beginning of the end of their marriage. In hers, it was just another step in the process she had already set into motion. It was a test of his arrogance, of his assumptions, of his belief that everything in their marriage, everything in their life could be manipulated by him. But Denise wasn't concerned with the theatrics of his actions. She had seen it all before. The drama, the manipulation, the selfishness that came with his desire for more, for recognition, for validation. And now, she could see the cracks in the foundation of his assumptions. They were starting to show. Slowly at first, but now unmistakably. Daryl had assumed that Emily, as his wife, would follow along with whatever narrative he created. That she would be content to live in his shadow, to support him while he chased fleeting ambitions, never questioning the quiet arrangements they had made over the years. But Daryl had never understood her silence. He had mistaken it for acceptance, for complacency. He had never seen the strength behind it. He had never understood that silence, when chosen intentionally, is a form of control in itself. For Denise, there was no urgency. There was no need to force things, to rush ahead. She had learned long ago the art of waiting. And now, as she sat surrounded by her father's carefully crafted legal papers, she understood more than ever that she had all the time in the world. Daryl might be impatient, might feel the need to act and speak quickly, but she didn't need to rush. She had already won this fight, even if he didn't realize it yet. Denise knew that Daryl, deep down, was still operating under a set of assumptions. He believed that her silence was a sign of resignation, that her lack of reaction meant she had given up. He was wrong. Her silence was her strength, and in the days and weeks that followed, he would begin to realize just how wrong he had been. But for now, Denise remained focused on the practical matters at hand. Her father's legacy, her financial independence, the future she was quietly building for herself. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to Daryl. It was about securing her own future, one where she would never have to rely on him, on his desires, on his neglect. She would never have to ask for permission to live her life. It had always been about independence, about control, but not in the way Daryl had imagined it. The control Denise wielded was one of quiet confidence, of methodical precision. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make demands. She just needed to wait. And as she reviewed the last of her father's documents, her fingers tracing the final signatures, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was the kind of peace that comes from knowing that everything was already in place. The steps had already been taken. Daryl, on the other hand, was still operating on the assumption that he had time, that he could force things into his desired shape. But the truth was that he had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, Daryl continued his life with the same arrogance that had always defined him. He went about his days, assuming that Denise would eventually confront him, that eventually she would break down, demand answers, beg for him to stay. He believed that her silence was just a prelude to a final emotional breakdown. It never occurred to him that Denise's silence was a choice. It never crossed his mind that she might be waiting for something, waiting for him to reveal his true nature, waiting for the moment when he would finally show his hand. And so, Daryl continued on, believing that his actions were inevitable, that his affair would soon become public knowledge and, in turn, would force Denise's hand. He didn't realize that every move he made, every careless word he spoke, was just another part of the narrative he had written for himself. He had convinced himself that he was in control, that his arrogance and entitlement would carry him through, that his actions would be excused by the justification of his desires. But Denise wasn't playing his game. She didn't need to. She had already written her own story, and in the silence of her home, surrounded by her father's legal documents, Denise knew that it was only a matter of time before Daryl would learn the truth, that his assumptions had already cost him everything. The air in the funeral hall was thick with a mix of grief and discomfort as Daryl stepped through the door, his hand wrapped tightly around Ashley's. She, heavily pregnant, walked beside him with an almost unsettling confidence. He didn't lower his head or glance around at the guests who watched him enter. Instead, he walked straight ahead, as if he were the one who deserved to be at the center of attention. The whispers that rippled through the room, from guest to guest, seemed to hold no weight in his mind. His focus remained on the woman at his side, as if her presence alone could shield him from the storm he had created. Denise Malone stood at the front of the room, near her father's casket. She was dressed in black, her posture straight and her gaze focused. The funeral had been meticulously arranged, just as her father would have wanted, and she had taken on the responsibility of handling it all with the same calm precision that had been her trademark for years. But today, there was something else beneath her composure, something that only those who truly knew her might understand. Today, she wasn't just playing the role of the grieving daughter. She wasn't just the widow standing at the side of a father's funeral. She was a woman standing at the precipice of a moment that would change everything. As Daryl and Ashley made their way toward the front, Denise didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't move to confront him. She didn't even blink. Instead, she held her ground, her gaze fixed, her expression neutral. The stillness of her presence was the first thing Daryl noticed. It unnerved him. The tension in the room had escalated. And yet, Denise remained unfazed. He had expected an outburst, a tearful confrontation, something that would validate his assumption of her emotional collapse. But there was nothing. Only silence. Only calm. For the first time in their relationship, Daryl felt the sharp sting of confusion. His mind raced. He had assumed that, at some point, Denise would give him a reason to feel justified, to feel less guilty. He was used to being the one in control, used to calling the shots in their marriage. But this time, Denise wasn't reacting as he'd expected. There was no anger, no frustration, no pleading. There was just a quiet strength that seemed to grow with every passing second. His confidence began to waver, though he refused to show it. Ashley, sensing the shift in the room, tightened her grip on Daryl's arm. She glanced nervously around, her discomfort rising with every whisper that spread like wildfire through the mourners. She had known Daryl was married, of course, but she hadn't expected this kind of reception. She had been prepared for some tension, maybe even for an argument, but what she hadn't accounted for was Denise's unyielding silence. Ashley had been waiting for something, anything, that would make sense of the situation, but all she saw was Denise standing still, composed and in control. Denise didn't acknowledge Ashley. She didn't need to. The moment was not about her. It was about Daryl. It was about showing him that his assumptions were wrong. All the years of being the passive partner, the one who stayed quiet, the one who didn't push back, today it would pay off. She wasn't here to explain herself. She wasn't here to make Daryl feel comfortable. She was here to let him understand that, for once, he had no control over the situation. As Daryl and Ashley took their seats, Denise didn't turn to look at them. She kept her focus ahead, allowing the ceremony to unfold as it was meant to. Her father's life was being celebrated, his quiet strength and meticulous nature honored by the people who had known him best. The eulogies were spoken with care, each word measured, each memory shared with respect. The room seemed to settle into a rhythm of grief and remembrance, but Daryl couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His discomfort grew with every passing minute. He had expected a confrontation, a verbal sparring match that would somehow make him feel less guilty for the spectacle he had brought to this solemn occasion. But instead, he felt the weight of Denise's silence bearing down on him. It was heavier than any angry words could have been. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that called into question everything he had taken for granted. His mind spun, trying to make sense of it. Why wasn't she reacting? Was she in denial? Or was she simply too emotionally detached to care? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. His mind tried to convince him that everything would be fine, that Denise would eventually break down, that she would confront him, that she would beg for reconciliation. But she didn't. The minutes ticked by and still, Denise remained composed. She listened to the eulogies, she interacted with the guests who approached her, and she never once showed the cracks he had expected to see. By the time the service concluded, Daryl was on edge. He felt like an outsider in a room that should have been filled with sympathy and understanding. But instead, there was a quiet judgment in the air. People who had once been friendly toward him now seemed to avoid his gaze, their eyes darting between him and Denise. It was as if they could all sense something he couldn't, something about his behavior that had crossed a line, something that made his presence at the funeral feel wrong. As the guests began to leave, many offering condolences to Denise in hushed tones, Daryl stood up, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. He had expected to be the one in control of the narrative, the one who would dictate the terms of his future with Ashley. But now he felt small, insignificant, as if all the power he thought he had was slipping through his fingers. Ashley, still by his side, noticed his unease. "Should we go?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Daryl hesitated, his gaze shifting toward Denise, who was still standing by the casket. There was no confrontation, no accusation, no emotion at all. Just a quiet, steady presence that seemed to challenge everything he had believed about their marriage. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that would make sense of it all. But there was none, and for the first time in his life he couldn't control the situation. "We should go," he muttered, his voice strained. He turned and made his way toward the exit, Ashley following behind him. As they stepped outside into the muted light of the afternoon, Daryl's chest tightened. The funeral was over, but the weight of Denise's silence hung in the air. Back inside, Denise watched them leave, her composure unwavering. She wasn't angry. She wasn't devastated. She wasn't even disappointed. She was simply watching, quietly preparing for the inevitable. She knew this day would come, the day when Daryl would miscalculate his power, the day when he would believe his actions had no consequences. But she wasn't here to correct him. She was here to let him reveal himself, to let him expose the truth of who he really was. And when the time came, when the truth finally surfaced, she would be ready. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to explain herself. She just needed to let him believe he had control until he no longer did. As she left the funeral hall, Denise didn't look back. She didn't need to. Everything had already been set in motion. Denise sat at the polished wooden desk in her study, the quiet hum of the house the only sound around her. Her fingers traced the edges of the leather-bound folder before her, the weight of it no longer just symbolic but a tangible representation of her father's careful planning. She had always known the documents were there, always understood that the trust he had set up for her was meant to protect her, but she hadn't truly internalized its power until now. Today, in the silence of her home, it became clear. Everything was already in place. Her father had anticipated everything. His meticulous nature had left no room for error. The will, the trust, the financial structures, they were all designed with an understanding of what could come. And now, Denise understood it too. Daryl had assumed that his actions, his betrayal, would go unchallenged. He thought his affair, his growing arrogance, and his control over their marriage would break her. But what he didn't realize was that her father's planning had already anticipated this moment. Daryl was not part of the picture. He never had been. Denise had watched Daryl for months as his affair with Ashley progressed, and she had patiently waited. She hadn't confronted him, hadn't raised her voice. She had simply allowed things to unfold, quietly preparing for the moment when the truth would be revealed, when Daryl would finally understand the full extent of her independence. That moment was drawing closer, and Denise could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She opened the folder and began to review the documents once again. The will was clear. Everything was set up to ensure her financial security, and most importantly, Daryl had no claim to any of it. Not the house, not the investments, not even the smallest portion of the fortune her father had accumulated over his life. All of it was protected by the trust that had been activated upon her father's passing. It wasn't just a safety net. It was a fortress built to withstand any claim, any attempt to infringe on her inheritance. The trust was the foundation of everything. It was impenetrable, airtight, and fully in her control. Daryl could never access the funds, not without violating terms that were so strict, they would have had legal repercussions severe enough to destroy him. This wasn't a fortune she had earned. It wasn't something that had been passed down through generations. It was her father's foresight, his gift of protection. He had known that his daughter, strong and quiet as she was, would one day need this security. Denise paused for a moment, allowing herself a brief breath of relief. The thought of what Daryl might do if he ever realized this truth made her tense. But she reminded herself that he wasn't capable of understanding the depth of her preparation. He believed, as always, that control came from the obvious, the visible. He thought power came from loud gestures, from manipulation, from demanding attention. But Denise had learned long ago that true power was quiet. It didn't need to be flaunted. It just needed to be ready when the moment arrived. Her eyes drifted over the legal documents again, checking each detail with the precision her father had instilled in her. Everything was correct. Everything was accounted for. Daryl had no claim. The trust was hers alone. As long as she followed the rules that her father had laid out with a lawyer's precision, there was nothing Daryl could do to interfere. And she would follow those rules, carefully and with the same quiet determination that had guided her all these years. Denise set the folder down and reached for her phone. She had scheduled a meeting with her lawyer earlier that week, knowing that the time had come to finalize her divorce proceedings. She had expected it would take longer to come to this point, but now, with everything in place, there was no more need for delay. She would not let Daryl continue to think he could dictate the terms of their marriage. She arrived at the law firm's office, the familiar scent of polished wood and old books greeting her as she walked through the door. Her lawyer, Laura Bennett, stood from behind her desk to greet her. The two women exchanged a brief but knowing glance. There was no need for small talk. Laura already understood why Denise was here. "Everything's ready?" Laura asked, her voice professional but kind. Denise nodded. "Everything is ready." The conversation that followed was straightforward, the papers laid out in front of them as they discussed the final steps of the divorce. The terms were simple, at least from Denise's perspective. Daryl was entitled to nothing. He had no claim to her inheritance, no claim to the trust that her father had set up. The assets had already been sealed, and Denise was free to proceed with her life without Daryl's influence. Laura handed her a document, the final divorce papers that would be submitted for review. "This is it," she said. "Once you sign these, it's official. The legal separation will be in place, and the trust will remain intact. Daryl will have no legal recourse. He won't be able to challenge anything." Denise took the papers and signed them without hesitation. There was no dramatic moment, no outburst of emotion. It was just another step toward freedom, another part of the process she had started long ago. She didn't need to shout or make a scene. Her calmness, her quiet control was all the statement she needed to make. But just as Denise finished signing the papers, something unexpected happened. Laura's phone buzzed on the desk, a text message flashing across the screen. Laura looked at it for a moment, her eyebrows raising slightly before she looked up at Denise. "I'm sorry," Laura said, hesitating for just a second. "It's Daryl. He's trying to contact you about the divorce." Denise looked at Laura without reacting, her face as composed as it had been throughout the meeting. "What does he want?" she asked, her voice calm. "He wants to meet with you," Laura replied, her tone thoughtful. "He says he wants to discuss the terms of the divorce, maybe negotiate a settlement." Denise's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. She had known this moment would come, knew that Daryl would try to negotiate, try to force her into some sort of emotional compromise. It was what he always did, after all. He believed he could convince her to bend, to give in to his demands, just as he had done so many times before. But this time was different. This time, he didn't have the leverage he thought he did. This time, Denise was the one holding all the cards. She shook her head gently. "Tell him no. There's nothing to negotiate. It's done." Laura smiled, a knowing look crossing her face as she glanced at the signed papers in front of them. "Of course, I'll let him know. He won't be happy about it, but it's clear that he's not going to get what he's expecting." Denise stood up, collecting her things with deliberate calm. "I'm sure he won't be," she said quietly, her mind already moving ahead to the next step in her life. A life where Daryl's presence was no longer a concern. She had long since made her peace with what had happened, and now it was time for him to learn the hard truth, that he had never truly been in control. As Denise left the office, the weight of the divorce papers still in her bag, she felt a wave of relief. Not from the legal battle she had just won, but from knowing that the moment had come. Daryl's actions, his affair, his arrogance. It had all led to this moment of revelation. And soon, very soon, he would understand just how wrong he had been. The weeks that followed the signing of the divorce papers were a careful dance for Daryl Utz. He continued to move through life with the same arrogance and entitlement he always had, assuming that his world was still within his grasp. Every morning, he left for work, as if nothing had changed. His mistresses, his distractions, his belief that he could manipulate and control. None of it seemed to shift. His mind stayed firmly locked in the belief that Denise's silence meant submission. That, despite everything, he was the one in control of their marriage and the narrative of their lives. Yet, every reckless decision, every impulsive action, only added fuel to the fire that Denise had been quietly tending for months. Daryl thought he was on top of the situation, that he could smooth things over by spending, by controlling their assets, by distracting himself with the idea that the legal papers he'd signed were just a formality. But it was more than that. Denise had prepared for this moment long before he ever made his first misstep. Each reckless purchase, every bit of manipulation, was being quietly documented by her. His actions, his words, his behavior. All of it was building a case. Denise didn't confront him. She didn't engage with his nonsense. She simply watched. The house was as still as it always had been, but inside, there was an undeniable tension growing. She could feel the inevitability of his downfall drawing nearer, and she remained ever so patient, the weight of her silence now feeling like a heavy hand resting on Daryl's chest, slowly but surely squeezing the air from his lungs. The reckless spending began first. Daryl, seemingly unaware that Denise had control over the majority of their finances, started draining their shared accounts without hesitation. His credit card bills skyrocketed as he purchased lavish gifts for Ashley, extravagant dinners, and high-end designer clothes. He was living as though the divorce hadn't occurred, as if the wealth he had once shared with Denise was still his to squander. He indulged in whatever his whims desired, never once considering the consequences. Denise watched with quiet precision. Every receipt, every transaction, was captured in her mind, catalogued in the small notebook she kept hidden from view. She had learned the power of patience early in life, and now it was becoming her greatest asset. While Daryl played his game, she was laying the groundwork for his downfall. She documented his reckless spending, his increasingly erratic behavior, his belief that money would shield him from the consequences of his actions. All of it was being carefully filed away, as if she were collecting the puzzle pieces to a picture Daryl wouldn't be able to recognize until it was too late. Meanwhile, Daryl continued to operate under the false assumption that he had everything under control. He never once suspected that Denise, the woman he had so often underestimated, was silently compiling evidence that would expose his every move. He thought he could continue to manipulate their finances and avoid the consequences of his affair. But as he dug himself deeper into debt, Denise's quiet observation turned into a careful strategy, one that would inevitably topple the house of cards he had built for himself. As the months passed, Denise stayed focused, her every decision calculated with meticulous care. She didn't engage with Daryl's increasingly erratic behavior. She didn't need to. She let him think that he was the one holding the reins, but with each passing day, he was sinking further into a hole he couldn't climb out of. Denise didn't need to yell, didn't need to argue. The truth was slowly being revealed, not through confrontation, but through his own mistakes. The legal proceedings were as seamless as they were unavoidable. Denise's lawyer, Laura, had been working behind the scenes, preparing the final paperwork to divide their assets. It was clear to both of them that Daryl had no real claim to any of it. The trust, the inheritance, the house. Everything had been put in place long before he ever realized how much he had overstepped. Laura kept Denise informed, but the real work was being done quietly, out of sight, while Daryl continued to flounder, sure of his dominance in the situation. Daryl's frustrations grew as he realized that he couldn't outpace the legal proceedings. He had always been a man of action, of dominating the narrative through manipulation. But this time, the narrative was written before he even entered the story. His attempts to confront Denise, to make her feel guilty for wanting a divorce, fell flat. His calls to her lawyer were met with polite indifference, as if they were just formalities. Denise's calm remained an impenetrable barrier that only seemed to frustrate him more. The legal papers began to move forward. Daryl was forced to sign documents he didn't fully understand, his every action now dictated by Denise's quiet authority. Each document Denise signed marked the end of his control, the final nail in the coffin of his self-imposed reign over their marriage. The more he pushed, the more he revealed his own desperation. But it wasn't just his spending or his lies or his lack of understanding that would bring him to his knees. It was his belief that power, control, and influence could be bought and sold, just like the luxury items he had purchased without a second thought. Denise had already learned that the real power came from a place that couldn't be bought. It came from silence, from patience, from taking control of what was hers, from knowing when to act and when to let things unfold in their own time. As the proceedings continued, Denise never wavered. She didn't engage with Daryl, didn't fight back against his accusations or his attempts to guilt-trip her into reconsidering. He thought that his tantrums, his threats, his attempts at charm would work. But they didn't. Denise was steady, firm, unwavering. She never allowed herself to be drawn into his drama. She had learned long ago that the greatest victory was in letting the other person expose themselves, in letting them dig their own grave. Daryl didn't know it yet, but every decision he made was pushing him closer to his downfall. The final revelation came in a letter, delivered by Denise's lawyer to Daryl's office. The contents were simple but devastating. A full account of his reckless spending, his legal violations, his repeated attempts to drain the accounts, and his disregard for the terms of their agreement. The papers outlined the division of assets, and the terms of the divorce were clear. Daryl was left with nothing. Denise didn't need to say anything. The letter spoke for her. She wasn't interested in a public showdown. She didn't care about forcing Daryl to admit he had been wrong. She knew that his mistakes had already been laid bare, and no amount of denial could change that. Daryl's reaction was as expected, panic. He called Laura, demanding answers, but the responses were calculated, measured, impersonal. No one was rushing to explain. No one was offering sympathy. For the first time in his life, Daryl Oots found himself entirely alone, trapped by his own mistakes, unable to manipulate the situation any longer. He had misjudged everything. He had misjudged Denise. He had assumed that his power, his wealth, and his ability to control would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Denise's quiet strength, her ability to remain calm in the face of his chaos, had stripped him of everything. His wealth had been a mask, his manipulations a distraction. Denise's silence had been his downfall, not just in their marriage but in his understanding of the world around him. As the legal proceedings came to a close, Daryl was left with nothing but the weight of his own arrogance. The house, the wealth, the future he had once believed was his, all of it slipped through his fingers like sand. And as Denise walked away, her head held high, she knew that she had done more than just protect herself. She had let Daryl reveal his true nature, and in doing so, had ensured that he would never have control over her again. The story was over. The chapter had closed, and Daryl was left to face the consequences of his own hubris.